Picture yourself for a moment. When was the last time you truly felt cold? Not the brief shiver from stepping outside to your car or the momentary chill of an air-conditioned room, but real cold, the kind that seeps through every layer, that makes your breath cloud even indoors, that turns water to ice overnight and keeps it frozen for months. What if that cold wasn't just an inconvenience, but the defining force of half your life? Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of North America, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. I treasure seeing how far our circle of time travelers reaches. What lies ahead is a story you'll want to hear. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. A quiet, relentless examination of everything you knew about survival, community, and the delicate balance between human need and nature's harsh indifference. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Let the warmth of your modern comfort wrap around you as we drift back to a time when warmth was earned, moment by moment, breath by breath. The snow is beginning to fall outside our imaginary longhouse. Can you hear it? That soft whisper against bark walls, the way it muffles all sound until the world becomes nothing but white silence and the crackle of carefully tended fires. The northeastern woodlands and Great Plains, 1500, 1700. The first sensation that greets you as consciousness returns is the cold. Not the sharp bite of winter air, but something more insidious. A slow, steady chill that has crept through the bark walls of the longhouse while you slept, settling into your bones like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. Your breath, clouds in the dim pre-dawn light, filtering through the smoke hole above. Even here, surrounded by the warmth of 20 other bodies sharing this communal dwelling, winter finds its way in. The fire at the center of the longhouse has burned low during the night, not extinguished, never extinguished, for that would mean death, but reduced to glowing embers that offer more promise than actual heat. You lie still for a moment, reluctant to leave the shared warmth of buffalo robes and woven blankets. Around you, the soft breathing of your extended family creates small clouds in the frigid air. Your grandmother's weathered hands are tucked close to her chest. Your youngest cousin sleeps curled like a small animal, conserving every bit of heat his tiny body can generate. This is February, the moon of popping trees, when the cold is so fierce that ancient oaks split with sounds like thunderclaps echoing across the frozen landscape. You have lived through 23 of these winters, and each one has taught you the same lesson. Survival is not dramatic. It is quiet, methodical, and measured in the smallest victories. The rhythm of your days begins before dawn. You ease yourself from beneath the robes, feeling the immediate bite of air against your skin. Your breath comes in short puffs as you pad barefoot across the packed earth floor to where the central fire waits. This is your responsibility this week. You and your brother take turns ensuring the longhouse fire never dies. Death by cold is not a quick thing. It comes slowly, with drowsiness and surrender, stealing life so gently that by the time you realize what's happening, your fingers are too numb to strike flint against steel. The firewood beside the hearth has been carefully rationed. Each stick represents a decision: warmth now or warmth later. The pile seems smaller every morning, though you know your uncle and the other men venture out daily to gather more. Finding dry wood beneath feet of snow is an art form. Dead branches must be broken free from trees, their inner wood split to reveal the dry heart beneath the frost-soaked exterior. You add 2 pieces to the fire, not 3, never 3, unless someone is truly sick. The flames lick up gratefully, casting dancing shadows across the curved walls. For a few precious moments you hold your hands close to the warmth, feeling sensation return to fingers that have grown stiff overnight. The water gourds near the fire have a thin skin of ice across their surface, despite being placed in the warmest spot of the longhouse. You break through with careful pressure, listening to the soft crack that means your family will have water for the morning meal. Later, when the sun climbs higher, someone will venture out to the stream, if it isn't frozen solid, to refill these containers. More often, they will return with chunks of ice and snow to melt over the fire, each pot of water representing precious fuel that could have been saved for warmth. Your stomach contracts with the particular ache that has become familiar since the snows began in earnest 3 moons ago. Not the sharp pain of true starvation, your people are too careful for that, but the constant, gnawing reminder that food is finite. Each meal is smaller than your body wants. Each handful of parched corn, each strip of dried venison, each precious walnut from last autumn's gathering must be considered against tomorrow's hunger. You move to the food cache, suspended from the rafters in bark containers that keep out mice and preserve what little your family has left. The dried corn rattles softly as you measure out portions for the morning meal. These kernels, golden and hard as small stones, were harvested in the warm abundance of late summer. Then they seemed endless. Basket after basket carried from the fields, each one a promise of security through the cold months ahead. Now each kernel is weighed in your mind. Ground into meal, they will make a thin porridge that will warm your belly and give you strength for the day's work. But the containers are less than half full, and the snow outside shows no signs of melting. The elderly women who know such things speak in quiet voices of a late spring. The migrating birds have not returned. The sap has not begun to run in the maple trees. Winter still has its grip firm around your world. You add a small handful of dried beans to your palm, feeling their smooth surfaces. These, combined with the corn, provide the protein your body craves in the cold. Your people call them the 3 sisters: corn, beans, and squash. Plants that grow together, support each other, and sustain life through the harshest seasons. But the dried squash is nearly gone now, saved for the youngest children and the nursing mothers who need every bit of nourishment. From another container you take a few nuts, butternuts and hickory nuts, their shells dark with age. Cracking these requires careful work. The meat inside is rich with the oils your body needs to maintain warmth, but nuts are precious. Each one eaten now is one less for the desperate weeks that might come if winter extends deeper into what should be spring. The water begins to steam in the clay pot suspended over the fire. You add the cornmeal slowly, stirring with a wooden paddle worn smooth by countless hands. The mixture thickens into a porridge that will serve 8 people. In summer, this amount might feed 3. But winter teaches different mathematics. Around you, the longhouse stirs to quiet life. Your aunt rises silently, adding her own small portion of dried berries to the communal pot, a gesture that will give the morning meal a hint of sweetness but represents a significant sacrifice from her family's stores. Your uncle sits up slowly, his joints stiff from the cold. At 45, he is already an old man by the standards of your people, his hands gnarled from decades of winter work, his face deeply lined from squinting against snow glare and bitter wind. No one speaks much in the mornings. Words seem to freeze in the cold air, and energy is too precious to waste on unnecessary conversation. But there is comfort in the shared routine, the quiet cooperation that keeps the longhouse functioning. the small gestures of care that bind your extended family together against winter's assault. Your youngest cousin wakes with the particular fussiness of a hungry child. At 3 years old, he does not understand rationing. He cries for food with the urgent distress that only comes from a growing body that needs more than it receives. Your aunt lifts him to her hip, offering him warmth from her body as she waits for the porridge to finish cooking. The meal, when it comes, is eaten slowly, not from ceremony, but from necessity. Each spoonful must be savoured, made to last, stretched to provide maximum satisfaction. The warm porridge helps, its heat spreads through your chest and belly, creating the illusion of fullness. The berries burst with flavour that reminds you of summer, of abundance, of days when food was everywhere for the taking. But even as you eat, part of your mind is calculating. How many more mornings like this can your family endure? The stores are diminishing with mathematical precision. By your count, the corn will last perhaps 6 more weeks if rationed carefully. The dried meat, strips of venison and elk killed during the autumn hunts, might stretch through 4 weeks. The nuts and dried berries will be gone within days if consumed at even this reduced rate. This mental arithmetic is not despair. It is survival strategy. Your people have endured countless winters by facing hunger with clear eyes and careful planning. The elderly remember worse years, the winter when the snows came early and stayed late, when families were reduced to boiling bark and leather to stay alive. Those stories are told not to frighten, but to remind. You have survived before, and you will survive again. After the meal, the day's work begins. The men will venture out into the bitter cold to check trap lines set along game trails. Even in the depths of winter, rabbits and other small creatures move through the forest. A single rabbit, skinned and added to the cooking pot, can extend the evening meal for the entire longhouse. Its fur, carefully prepared, can patch holes in moccasins or line a child's winter clothing. Your task today is repairing moccasins. The constant walking through snow and over frozen ground has worn holes in the soles of 3 pairs. Without proper footwear, the cold becomes deadly within hours. Frostbite creeps into exposed flesh with silent persistence, killing toes and fingers that seem merely numb until they turn black and begin to fall away. You settle near the fire with an assortment of materials: pieces of deer hide, soaked in water to make them pliable, sinew threads that will serve as both needle and thread, scraps of fur to line the interior. The work requires steady hands and good light, both challenging in the dim interior of the winter longhouse. As you work, your fingers grow stiff despite the fire's warmth. The hide is reluctant to take the needle, requiring pressure that sends small jolts of pain through knuckles already swollen from cold. But the work is meditative, rhythmic. Each stitch is a small victory against winter's assault, each completed moccasin a barrier between your family and death. Your grandmother settles beside you with her own work, spinning thread from plant fibers gathered and prepared before the snows came. Her movements are economical, conserved. At 70, she has lived through more winters than anyone else in the longhouse. Her presence is both comfort and reminder. Survival is possible, but it requires constant vigilance. The wind is shifting, she says quietly, her first words of the day. You listen, hearing what she hears, a change in the sound as it moves around the longhouse, a subtle alteration in the way it whistles through the gaps in the bark walls. To your untrained ear, it sounds like the same bitter wind that has blown for weeks. But grandmother's weather sense has been honed by decades of necessity. Snow coming, she adds, not looking up from her spinning. Tonight, maybe tomorrow. More snow means the men's hunting will be even more difficult. Game trails will be obscured, the cold will be more bitter, and the careful rationing of firewood will become even more critical as the need for warmth increases. Midday brings a small excitement. Your cousin returns from checking snares with 2 rabbits frozen stiff in his hunting bag. The entire longhouse receives this news with quiet satisfaction, not celebration, for that would waste energy and tempt fate, but the settled pleasure that comes with unexpected fortune. The rabbits are skinned immediately, their fur set aside for future use. Every part will be utilized: meat for the pot, bones for tools, sinew for thread, organs for the children who need the concentrated nutrition. Nothing is wasted in winter. Waste is a luxury your people cannot afford. The afternoon passes in quiet industry. Women and older children tend to indoor work, repairing clothing, crafting tools, preparing materials for spring planting that seems impossibly distant. Men venture out in pairs to gather firewood, following paths beaten down by previous expeditions. The children too young for heavy work are kept close to the fire, their bodies not yet efficient enough at generating heat to survive extended exposure to the cold. You finish 2 pairs of moccasins by the time shadows begin to lengthen. The work has kept your hands busy and your mind focused on something other than the persistent ache in your belly. The completed footwear represents security, protection against the cold that will extend the wearer's ability to venture outside for food gathering or essential tasks. Evening approaches with the particular quality of winter light, the way afternoon slides directly into dusk with no gradual transition, the sun disappearing behind bare trees that stand like dark skeletons against the grey sky. The temperature, which never rose above freezing even at midday, begins to drop toward the bone-deep cold of night. Dinner is the rabbit stew stretched with water, wild onions from the stored vegetables, and a handful of precious corn. The meat, divided among 20 people, provides little more than flavor and the psychological comfort of knowing animal protein is entering your body. But the warm broth helps. It creates the sensation of fullness, provides liquid your cold-stressed body needs, and offers a brief respite from the constant calculation of calories and nutrients. As darkness settles over the longhouse, the evening activities begin. This is when stories are told, not for entertainment, though they provide that, but as education. The elderly share knowledge that will help younger members survive future winters. Which plants can be eaten when all other food is gone? How to read weather signs in the behavior of animals and the movement of clouds. How to find water when streams are frozen solid. Tonight, your uncle speaks of the winter he was separated from his hunting party during a blizzard. For 3 days, he survived by following deer tracks to places where they had poured through snow to reach dried grass beneath. He ate what the deer ate, found water where they had broken through ice, and stayed alive by copying their survival strategies. The animals are the first teachers, he says, his voice low and hypnotic in the firelight. They do not waste movement. They conserve energy. They seek shelter when the wind tells them to seek shelter. Watch them and learn. The story continues with the quiet rhythm of winter storytelling. Not dramatic peaks and valleys, but the steady flow of information disguised as narrative. How to construct emergency shelter from snow and deadfall. Which direction to travel when lost in whiteout conditions. How to stay warm without fire by using your own body heat efficiently. These stories serve multiple purposes. They pass time during the long winter evenings. They preserve knowledge essential for survival. And they create bonds within the community, shared experiences and wisdom that tie individual survival to group survival. As the evening progresses, people begin to settle into their sleeping areas. The fire is banked but not extinguished. It will burn low through the night, providing just enough heat to prevent the longhouse from becoming a tomb of frozen bodies. Someone will wake every few hours to add wood, maintaining the delicate balance between conservation and survival. You arrange your sleeping furs with the careful attention that winter demands. Each fold, each layer must be positioned to trap warm air while preventing cold drafts from finding their way to your skin. You sleep fully clothed. Removing garments would mean losing precious body heat that might take hours to regenerate. Your stomach contracts with the now familiar hunger that accompanies sleep. 2 meals today, both smaller than your body wants, tomorrow will bring the same routine, the same calculations, the same quiet struggle against cold and scarcity. But as you settle into the shared warmth of families sleeping close together, there is comfort in the steadiness of it all. This is not the dramatic survival of adventure stories. There are no heroic moments, no single acts of courage that determine life or death. Instead, there is the patient accumulation of small victories. Another day lived, another night survived, another morning closer to spring. Outside, the wind picks up as grandmother predicted. You can hear it beginning to drive fresh snow against the longhouse walls. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new calculations, new small tests of endurance and wisdom. But for now, surrounded by the quiet breathing of your family, warmed by the carefully maintained fire, you close your eyes and let sleep take you. Winter still has its grip on the land, but you have learned its rhythms. You have adapted to its demands. You have found the quiet strength that carries your people through the harshest seasons. The snow continues to fall outside, soft and relentless, adding to the white blanket that covers the world. But inside the longhouse, life continues, patient, enduring, and surprisingly full of small contentments that make survival not just possible, but meaningful. In the morning, you will wake to the same cold, the same hunger, the same careful rationing of warmth and food, but you will also wake to the shared strength of community, the accumulated wisdom of generations, and the quiet certainty that your people have survived worse winters than this. And spring, though distant, will come again. Massachusetts Bay, 1585-1622. As the fire settles into glowing embers and our longhouse grows quiet around us, let us drift our attention across time and space to another winter, another life shaped by the relentless demands of survival. But this story carries a different kind of cold, not just the physical bite of New England winters, but the deeper chill that comes when everything familiar disappears, leaving a man suspended between worlds that will never again touch. His name was Tisquantum, though history would remember him by the shortened version, Squanto. And if you think survival in a Native American winter was challenging, imagine surviving the complete destruction of everything you had ever known, your people, your village, your very identity, and somehow finding the strength not just to endure, but to become a bridge between civilizations. Let us settle back into the gentle rhythm of his story, letting it wash over us like snowfall, each detail adding to a picture of resilience that defies easy understanding. The year is 1605, and Tisquantum is perhaps 20 years old, a young man of the Patuxet band of the Wampanoag Confederation. His world exists along the coast of what Europeans will call Massachusetts, in a village that sits where the town of Plymouth will later take root. But for now, there is no Plymouth. There are only the Patuxet people living in harmony with seasons that have remained unchanged for countless generations. Imagine Tisquantum in those early years before the ships came. Picture him learning the intricate knowledge that winter survival demanded. His hands, still smooth with youth, learning to weave fish traps from supple branches. His eyes, sharp and patient, tracking the movements of deer through bare November forests. His mind absorbing the countless lessons that would mean the difference between life and death when the snows came. The Patuxet had perfected winter survival over generations. Their village, positioned strategically near both ocean and forest, allowed them to harvest the sea's bounty even in the coldest months. Tisquantum would have learned to read the subtle signs that told when fish were running, when shellfish beds were most productive, when the ocean would yield up the seals and other marine mammals that provided both meat and oil for the long winter nights. But it was the corn that formed the foundation of winter survival. The three sisters, corn, beans and squash, planted together in carefully tended fields that stretched inland from the village. Tisquantum learned the secret that would later save the Plymouth colonists: plant each corn seed with a small fish, caught during the spring runs of herring and alewives. As the fish decomposed, it provided the rich nutrients that allowed corn to thrive in the sandy New England soil. The autumn of his youth would have been spent in the patient work of preparation. Corn dried on the stalks until the kernels were hard as stones, then carefully removed and stored in underground pits lined with bark. Squash sliced into spirals and hung from longhouse rafters, slowly dehydrating into leathery strips that would keep through the winter months. Beans picked at perfect ripeness and spread on mats to dry in the October sun. And always the hunting. Tisquantum would have joined the men tracking deer through forests painted brilliant with autumn colors, learning to read signs invisible to untrained eyes. The slight depression in fallen leaves where a deer had stepped, the height of broken branches that told the size of passing animals, the particular way sunlight fell through trees that revealed the paths game followed to water. Winter, when it came to the Patuxet village, was not the desperate struggle we witnessed in our earlier longhouse. The coastal location provided advantages. Ocean temperatures moderated the worst cold. Shellfish could be gathered even when inland streams froze solid. And the Patuxet had developed sophisticated methods of food preservation that allowed them to maintain nutrition through the harshest months. But Tisquantum's education in survival extended far beyond the practical. He learned the spiritual dimensions of winter, the ceremonies that maintained balance between human need and natural abundance. The stories told during long winter nights that preserved not just entertainment, but crucial knowledge about weather patterns, animal behavior, and the subtle signs that predicted when spring would return. He learned patience. The particular patience required to endure months when the world seemed locked in death, but was actually engaged in the slow, invisible process of renewal. This patience, this ability to endure uncertainty while maintaining hope, would serve him in ways he could not imagine. The ships first appeared in Patuxet waters when Tisquantum was a young man, perhaps 25 years old. These were not the Mayflower or the vessels of permanent settlement, but the earlier ships of exploration and trade. European fishermen had been working the rich Grand Banks off Newfoundland for decades, occasionally making contact with coastal tribes for trade or to repair their vessels. At first, these encounters seemed beneficial. The Europeans offered metal tools, knives, hatchets, copper kettles, that made winter preparation more efficient. A steel blade could process corn or cut firewood with an ease that stone tools could never match. Copper kettles heated more evenly than clay pots and were nearly indestructible. But the ships brought other things as well, diseases for which the Patuxet had no immunity: smallpox, typhus, influenza, illnesses that seemed minor inconveniences to Europeans but spread through native communities like wildfire, killing entire families within days. And they brought men with different ideas about trade. Not the careful, reciprocal exchanges that characterized intertribal relationships, but something more predatory. Something that viewed native people not as partners, but as resources to be exploited. The morning that changed Tisquantum's life forever came in 1614, during what should have been a routine trading encounter. Captain Thomas Hunt, commanding a ship under the authority of John Smith's New England expeditions, arrived in Patuxet waters offering the usual trade goods. But when young native men came aboard to examine the European wares, Hunt's crew seized them. 24 men were taken that day, including Tisquantum. They were bound and thrown into the ship's hold like cargo, beginning a journey that would carry them away from everything they had ever known. The last sound Tisquantum heard from his homeland was the cries of his people watching from shore as the ship disappeared over the horizon. The voyage to Spain was a nightmare that winter survival had not prepared him for. Crammed into the fetid darkness of the ship's hold with other captive men, breathing air thick with vomit and waste, fed spoiled food and brackish water, many of the captives died during the Atlantic crossing. Their bodies were thrown overboard like refuse, disappearing into waters that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. But Tisquantum endured. The patience learned during long winter nights, the ability to conserve energy during times of scarcity, the mental discipline that came from surviving months when death seemed closer than spring. All of these served him in the ship's hold. He did not fight the restraints that only caused injury. He ate the wretched food because his body needed sustenance. He stayed alive through sheer, stubborn will. Spain, when they finally reached it, was a world beyond imagination. Cities of stone that housed more people than Tisquantum had ever seen in his life. Languages he had never heard. Foods, smells, sounds, and sights that bore no relationship to anything in his experience. And slavery, the systematic reduction of human beings to property, to be bought and sold like tools or animals. Hunt intended to sell his native captives in the Spanish slave markets, but here Tisquantum encountered unexpected salvation. Spanish friars, members of religious orders dedicated to protecting indigenous peoples from slavery, intervened. The captive men were taken to monasteries where they were fed, clothed, and gradually introduced to European ways. For Tisquantum, this began years of extraordinary adaptation. He learned Spanish, absorbing not just vocabulary but the intricate grammar and cultural concepts embedded in the language. He learned about Christianity, not necessarily accepting it, but understanding how it shaped European thinking. He observed Spanish society with the same careful attention he had once paid to deer tracks, learning the patterns that governed this strange new world. But he never stopped thinking about home. Through fragments of conversation with sailors and traders, he began to piece together information about New England, about ships that traveled there, about the possibility, distant but real, of return. The opportunity came through his language skills. English ships occasionally put in at Spanish ports, and Tisquantum's growing ability with European languages made him valuable as an interpreter. An English captain, recognizing his usefulness, arranged for his passage to London. London in the 1610s was a city in transformation. The population was swelling beyond the capacity of medieval infrastructure. The Thames was a highway crowded with vessels of every description, and everywhere there was talk of the New World, of Virginia, of the cod fisheries, of the vast forests and fertile lands waiting across the Atlantic. For Tisquantum, London represented both opportunity and frustration. Here were ships that regularly sailed to New England waters. Here were men who knew his homeland, who could describe landmarks he recognized. But he was still a stranger, dependent on the goodwill of others, his fate controlled by forces beyond his influence. He found employment with various households, his exotic background making him a curiosity among London society. But he used this position strategically, always gathering information, always looking for the connection that might lead homeward. His patience, that deep winter patience learned in childhood, sustained him through years of waiting. The breakthrough came through Captain Thomas Dermer, an English explorer planning expeditions to New England. Dermer recognized the value of having a native guide who spoke English and understood European ways. In 1619, nearly 5 years after his capture, Tisquantum finally secured passage home. But the journey back was not a simple return. During his years of captivity, his world had continued to change in ways he could not have imagined. Disease had swept through the coastal tribes with devastating effectiveness. Entire villages had been wiped out. The carefully maintained balance between human communities and natural resources had been shattered. When Tisquantum finally reached familiar waters, he found a landscape that was recognizable but transformed. The forests were the same, the coastline unchanged, but the human presence that had given the land meaning was largely gone. Village sites that should have been bustling with life stood empty, marked only by scattered bones and the slowly collapsing remains of longhouses. Patuxet village, his birthplace, the center of his world, was deserted. The cornfields were overgrown with weeds. The fish traps lay broken in streams that had returned to their natural courses. Of the several thousand Patuxet who had lived there when he was captured, perhaps a few dozen survived, scattered among other bands or living isolated lives in the deep forest. This was a different kind of winter, not the seasonal cold that brought hardship, but also the promise of renewal, but the permanent winter of cultural destruction. Everything that had given structure and meaning to Tisquantum's early life was gone, swept away by diseases he had carried no blame for, but had somehow survived. Yet survival was what he knew how to do. The skills learned in childhood longhouses, refined through years of adaptation in Spain and England, now served him in this strange new world that was both his homeland and utterly foreign. He became a man between worlds, belonging fully to neither but capable of navigating both. When the Mayflower anchored in Plymouth Harbor in November 1620, Tisquantum was living with the Patuxet, the main band of the Wampanoag Confederation, led by Massasoit. The English colonists, struggling through their first New England winter, were facing the same challenges that had tested native communities for generations, but without the accumulated knowledge that made survival possible. Half of the Plymouth colonists died that first winter. They had arrived too late in the season to plant crops. Their European farming techniques were poorly suited to New England soil and climate. They did not know how to preserve food for extended cold periods, how to find fresh water when surface sources froze, or how to construct shelter that would retain heat efficiently. Tisquantum watched their struggles with the complex feelings of a man who had lost everything, but somehow retained the knowledge that might help others survive. These were people from the civilization that had destroyed his world, yet they were also human beings facing the same winter challenges that had shaped his entire life. When he finally made contact with the Plymouth colonists in March 1621, he brought more than language skills. He brought the accumulated wisdom of generations of New England winters. He taught them the fish and corn planting technique that would make their agriculture successful. He showed them how to tap maple trees for syrup, how to identify edible wild plants, how to construct fish traps that would work in local streams. Most importantly, he taught them patience. The European mindset expected quick results, immediate solutions to survival challenges. But New England winters required the long view, the ability to plan ahead, to prepare carefully, to endure uncertainty while working steadily toward distant goals. Under Tisquantum's guidance, the Plymouth colonists learned to think like winter survivors. They planted crops that would store well through cold months. They preserved meat and fish using native techniques. They constructed shelters designed for heat retention rather than appearance. They developed the patience to wait for results, to trust in preparations made months in advance. But Tisquantum's role was more complex than simple teacher. He served as interpreter not just of language, but of entire worldviews. When tensions arose between colonists and native bands, he translated not just words, but cultural concepts, helping each side understand the other's motivations and concerns. He negotiated the peace treaty between Plymouth and the Wampanoag Confederation that would last for more than 50 years. This agreement, reached in the spring of 1621, established principles of mutual aid and defense that recognized both English and native sovereignty within defined territories. Yet even as he helped create this fragile peace, Tisquantum must have understood its temporary nature. He had seen the European appetite for land and resources. He knew that more ships would come, carrying more colonists with different ideas about coexistence. The balance he was helping to create would not last forever. His final years were spent in constant motion, traveling between English settlements and native communities, serving as messenger, interpreter, and mediator. He was trusted by both sides but belonged fully to neither, his loyalty always questioned, his motivations always suspect. The winter of 1622 found him on Cape Cod, serving as guide for another English expedition. He fell ill with what colonists called Indian fever, probably typhus or another European disease to which he had finally succumbed after years of exposure. William Bradford, governor of Plymouth Colony, recorded that Tisquantum died, desiring the governor to pray for him that he might go to the Englishman's God in heaven. But this deathbed conversion, if it occurred, represented less a rejection of his native identity than a final act of adaptation. Tisquantum had learned to navigate between worlds, to find survival strategies in the most unlikely circumstances. Even in death, he was bridging differences, offering comfort to English observers while perhaps maintaining his own spiritual understanding. His grave site is unknown, marked by no monument except the continued existence of communities he helped survive their early winters. The Wampanoag Confederation, though greatly reduced, endured. Plymouth Colony grew into a permanent settlement that would eventually become part of Massachusetts, and the agricultural techniques he taught, particularly the fish and corn method, became standard practice throughout New England. But perhaps Tisquantum's greatest legacy was demonstrating that survival was possible even when everything familiar disappeared. He had lived through the complete destruction of his original world and somehow found the strength to help create a new one. His life was a testament to the deep patience learned during childhood winters, the ability to endure uncertainty while working steadily toward goals that might take years to achieve. As we let this story settle around us like gently falling snow, we might reflect on the different kinds of winter Tisquantum survived. The seasonal cold of his youth, harsh but predictable, followed by seasons of renewal, the social winter of captivity and displacement, where survival required constant adaptation to changing circumstances. And finally, the cultural winter that followed the destruction of his homeland, where survival meant creating entirely new relationships and identities. Each winter taught different lessons, but all required the same fundamental qualities: patience, careful observation, willingness to adapt, and the deep faith that survival was possible even when circumstances seemed impossible. His story reminds us that winter, whether seasonal or metaphorical, is not just about endurance. It is about transformation, about discovering resources within ourselves that we never knew existed. Tisquantum became someone who could never have existed in his original world or in European society alone, but only in the space between them. As sleep begins to claim us and the warmth of our modern comfort contrasts with the cold challenges of his life, we might appreciate the quiet heroism of adaptation. Not the dramatic gesture of a single moment, but the patient accumulation of small survivals, each day another step away from destruction and towards something new and unprecedented. The snow continues to fall outside our imaginary longhouse, but now it carries different meanings. Not just the promise of hardship, but the possibility of transformation. Not just the test of endurance, but the opportunity to discover strengths we never knew we possessed. Tisquantum's winters are long over, but the lessons embedded in his story continue to drift down like snowflakes, each one carrying the wisdom that survival is always possible, even when the familiar world disappears entirely. And sometimes, if we listen carefully to the wind, we can hear the echo of his patient voice, teaching us that the deepest winter knowledge is not about avoiding cold, but about finding warmth in the most unlikely places. As Tisquantum's story fades into the gentle darkness around us, let us drift deeper still, beyond the practical knowledge of survival, beyond even the remarkable adaptations of individuals, into the shadowy realm where the physical and spiritual worlds meet during winter's deepest grip. Here, in the flickering light of ceremonial fires, we find mysteries that archaeology can only hint at, rituals whose full meaning has been lost to time, like smoke disappearing into winter sky. The transition from the everyday world into this sacred space is gradual, like the way consciousness shifts as we move from wakefulness into dream. The ordinary concerns of winter survival, the counting of stored corn kernels, the rationing of dried meat, the constant tending of fires, begin to recede as we approach something far more profound. This is the realm where human beings attempted to negotiate not just with the physical forces of winter, but with the spiritual powers that were believed to control the very seasons themselves. Picture yourself now in a different kind of longhouse. Larger than the family dwelling we inhabited earlier, this is a ceremonial space where the boundaries between seasons, between the living and the dead, between hope and despair, grow thin as January ice. The construction itself speaks to purposes beyond mere shelter. The frame timbers are positioned according to principles that align with celestial movements, creating a structure that serves as both architectural space and cosmic instrument. The walls rise higher than those of domestic longhouses, creating room for the smoke of sacred fires to gather and swirl in patterns that experienced ceremonialists read like omens. The bark covering is applied in specific sequences, often incorporating materials gathered during particular seasons or under certain celestial conditions. Even the arrangement of sleeping platforms reflects ceremonial requirements, with specific positions reserved for participants of different spiritual rankings or clan affiliations. The air is thick with more than wood smoke. It carries the weight of prayers, the resonance of drums that beat like the earth's own heartbeat, the whispered words of ceremonies designed not just to ensure physical survival, but to maintain the spiritual balance that keeps the world itself from sliding into permanent winter. The very atmosphere becomes a medium for transformation, charged with intentions that have been building for weeks as the community prepared for these sacred days. Consider the acoustic properties of such a space. The high ceiling creates natural resonance chambers where the human voice takes on qualities impossible in smaller dwellings. Chants and songs echo and blend, creating harmonic overtones that seem to emanate from the structure itself. The rhythmic beating of water drums reverberates through the wooden frame, setting up sympathetic vibrations that participants can feel in their bones, in their heartbeats, in the very core of their being. This is the realm of the winter ceremonies, and here we must tread softly, for we are entering sacred ground where much remains hidden, deliberately preserved from the eyes of outsiders, or lost forever to the erosions of time and cultural disruption. The protection of this knowledge was not merely a matter of religious exclusivity, but of spiritual safety. Many tribal traditions held that certain ceremonial knowledge could be dangerous if misunderstood or misapplied, that the spiritual forces involved in winter ceremonies were powerful enough to cause harm if not approached with proper preparation and respect. The secrecy also served practical purposes during periods of cultural suppression. When European authorities and missionaries worked to eliminate indigenous spiritual practices, winter ceremonies often provided the most reliable means of maintaining traditional knowledge. Hidden in remote locations conducted during seasons when travel was difficult for outsiders, protected by the natural barriers of winter weather, these rituals became repositories for cultural wisdom that might otherwise have vanished entirely. The Haudenosaunee, the people Europeans called the Iroquois, developed perhaps the most elaborate winter ceremony known to have existed in North America. They called it the Midwinter Ceremony, and it began when the Pleiades constellation reached its highest point in the winter sky, usually in late January or early February. This timing was not arbitrary. It came during the deepest part of winter, when food stores were running lowest, when the cold seemed most likely to last forever, when the human spirit needed reinforcement against despair. The astronomical precision required for this timing reveals sophisticated observational knowledge that extended far beyond simple seasonal awareness. Haudenosaunee ceremonialists maintained detailed understanding of stellar movements, tracking not only the position of the Pleiades but also the relationships between various star groups, the patterns of planetary movements, and the subtle variations in celestial cycles that occurred over periods of years or even decades. This knowledge was preserved through complex mnemonic systems that combined star maps with landscape features, creating a kind of three-dimensional calendar that could be read by initiated observers even under challenging conditions. Sacred sites were often positioned to provide optimal viewing angles for crucial astronomical observations, and the ceremonial calendar was adjusted based on careful readings of celestial phenomena that indicated the precise spiritual conditions necessary for different rituals. But the ceremony was not simply a psychological comfort. It was understood as essential maintenance of cosmic order, a series of rituals that helped turn the great wheel of seasons, ensuring that winter would eventually release its grip and allow spring to return. Without these ceremonies, the Haudenosaunee believed the world might remain locked in eternal cold, life frozen into permanent stillness. This understanding reflects a worldview in which human activity and natural processes exist in constant dialogue. The ceremonies were not prayers asking for spring's return, but active participation in the cosmic mechanisms that made seasonal change possible. Each ritual element, every song, dance movement, offering, and prayer was understood as contributing to the vast spiritual machinery that kept the world functioning according to its proper patterns. The responsibility inherent in this worldview cannot be overstated. If the return of spring depended partly on human ceremonial activity, then communities bore not just the burden of their own survival, but cosmic responsibility for the continuation of life itself. The weight of this responsibility shaped every aspect of winter ceremonial preparation, from the selection of participants to the precise execution of ritual sequences that had been passed down through generations. Imagine the preparation that led up to these sacred days. For weeks beforehand, despite the privations of winter, families would have set aside portions of their carefully rationed food stores, not the moldy scraps or the least desirable parts, but some of their best preserved corn, their finest dried meat, their most precious nuts and berries. This was food that might mean the difference between survival and starvation in the weeks ahead, yet it was freely given to ensure the ceremony could proceed with proper abundance. The process of selecting these ceremonial offerings involved its own rituals. Families would examine their winter stores repeatedly, looking for signs that might indicate which portions were spiritually appropriate for sacred use. Corn kernels were inspected not just for physical quality, but for symbolic significance, their color patterns, size relationships, the way they felt when handled, even the sounds they made when poured from storage containers. Dried meat was evaluated according to the spiritual qualities of the animals from which it came. Venison from deer that had been taken in accordance with proper hunting protocols carried different ceremonial significance than meat from animals killed under less ideal circumstances. The dreams of the hunters who had taken the game, the seasonal timing of the hunts, the specific locations where the animals had been found, all of these factors influenced the spiritual potency of the meat and its appropriateness for different ceremonial uses. The gathering of wild foods for ceremony required even more specialized knowledge. Nuts and berries that had been collected during their peak seasons and properly preserved maintained spiritual connections to the times and places of their origin. The individuals who had gathered them, the ceremonies that had been performed during collection, the storage methods used, all contributed to the accumulated spiritual power that these foods would bring to winter ceremonies. This careful curation of ceremonial foods created a kind of spiritual archaeology, with each offering carrying layers of meaning that connected the winter ceremony to the entire annual cycle of subsistence activities. When these foods were finally consumed during the ceremony, participants were not simply sharing a meal, but participating in a communion that encompassed the full year's relationship between human communities and the natural world. The longhouse chosen for the ceremony would be the largest in the community. Its central fire pit expanded to accommodate the sacred flames that would burn continuously for days. The usual household furnishings would be moved aside, creating space for dancers, for the sacred objects that emerged only during these winter rites, for the community members who would gather from surrounding villages despite the dangers of winter travel. The modification of ceremonial space involved far more than simply rearranging furniture. The central fire pit was rebuilt according to specifications that reflected cosmological principles, with the arrangement of stones corresponding to spiritual directions and the size and shape calculated to produce optimal conditions for sacred flames. The fire itself was constructed using wood that had been selected and prepared according to ceremonial requirements, often including species chosen for their symbolic associations with different seasons or spiritual forces. The creation of dancing space required careful attention to acoustic properties and energy flow. The packed earth floor was prepared with materials that would enhance the resonant qualities of rhythmic movement, and the space was oriented to align with spiritual directions that would channel ceremonial energy most effectively. Sacred objects were positioned at specific points around the perimeter, creating a kind of spiritual circuit that would contain and focus the energy generated by ceremonial activities. The arrival of community members from distant villages transformed the longhouse into a temporary sacred city, a concentrated gathering of spiritual and social energy that existed nowhere else during the winter months. These gatherings represented enormous investments of time and resources, with participants traveling for days through dangerous winter conditions to reach the ceremonial site. The social dynamics of these gatherings were as complex as their spiritual dimensions. Different communities brought their own variations of ceremonial knowledge, creating opportunities for sharing and cross-fertilization of ritual practices. Elder ceremonialists used these occasions to transmit specialized knowledge to younger participants, while also observing and evaluating the spiritual development of potential successors. Archaeological excavations of ceremonial sites have revealed tantalizing glimpses of these winter rituals, though much remains mysterious. Archaeologists have found unusual concentrations of burned corn kernels, arranged in patterns that suggest ritual rather than accidental burning. The patterns themselves are intriguing. Some appear to correspond to star map configurations, others to the cardinal directions or to symbolic representations of seasonal cycles. The burning of corn in ceremonial contexts seems to have served multiple purposes. The act of destruction transformed stored food into smoke that could carry prayers to spiritual realms, while the specific patterns of burning may have created a kind of offering language that communicated particular messages or requests to spiritual forces. The careful arrangement of kernels before burning suggests that this was a highly formalized practice, with precise requirements for proper execution. Chemical analysis of these burned corn deposits has revealed additional layers of complexity. The corn used in ceremonies often shows evidence of special preparation, soaking in solutions that would alter burning characteristics or treatment with natural substances that would produce specific colors or fragrances when burned. This preparation work represents additional investments of time and resources that underscore the importance placed on ceremonial precision. They have discovered caches of specially crafted pottery, vessels decorated with winter symbols, designed specifically for ceremonial use, and then deliberately broken and buried, perhaps to carry prayers into the earth's depths. These ceremonial vessels represent some of the finest examples of indigenous artistry, with decoration that combines aesthetic beauty with complex symbolic meaning. The winter symbols found on ceremonial pottery include representations of bare trees, snow patterns, animal tracks, and abstract designs that may represent wind, cold, or the movement of celestial bodies during winter months. The artistic techniques used to create these symbols often differed from those employed in everyday pottery, suggesting that ceremonial vessels required specialized knowledge and skills. The deliberate destruction and burial of these beautiful objects speaks to spiritual concepts that valued transformation over preservation. The breaking of ceremonial vessels may have been understood as releasing their spiritual power into the earth, where it could continue to influence natural cycles even after the ceremony ended. The burial locations were carefully chosen, often at points where they would be covered by winter's deepest snows and revealed only when spring melting exposed them to sunlight once again. Most intriguingly, they have found evidence of what appear to be offerings made during the deepest cold. Animal bones that show signs of having been carefully prepared and placed in frozen ground, sometimes accompanied by shell beads, copper ornaments, or carved bone implements. These objects, buried when digging was almost impossible, suggest rituals of extraordinary importance, ceremonies significant enough to justify the tremendous effort required to break through frost-hardened earth. The effort required to create these frozen ground offerings cannot be overstated. Winter digging required specialized tools and techniques, often involving the use of fire to gradually thaw small areas of earth. The process was time-consuming and dangerous, as it required people to remain exposed to extreme cold for extended periods while working in difficult positions. The selection of burial locations for winter offerings followed complex protocols that combined practical considerations with spiritual requirements. Sites needed to be accessible even under deep snow, but also needed to possess appropriate spiritual characteristics. The relationship between burial sites and astronomical alignments, water sources, or particular landscape features often influenced these choices. The offerings themselves were prepared with extraordinary care. Animal bones show evidence of careful cleaning and sometimes decoration before burial. Accompanying objects were often crafted specifically for burial purposes, representing investments of precious winter time and materials that could have been used for survival necessities. But the physical artifacts tell only part of the story. The true mystery of winter ceremonies lies in their psychological and spiritual dimensions, aspects that leave no trace for archaeologists to uncover. We can only imagine the effect of gathering in the warm, firelit longhouse while bitter wind howled outside. The comfort of community voices raised in ancient songs, the hypnotic rhythm of water drums and turtle shell rattles, the shared participation in rituals that connected each individual to generations of ancestors who had performed these same ceremonies during their own desperate winters. The psychological impact of these ceremonies operated on multiple levels. The immediate comfort of warmth, light, and human company provided obvious relief from winter's harsh conditions. But the deeper effects came from participation in activities that created meaning out of hardship, that transformed suffering into spiritual significance, that connected individual experience to cosmic patterns of renewal and regeneration. The use of repetitive rhythms, hypnotic chanting, and synchronized movement created altered states of consciousness that enabled participants to access psychological resources not available during ordinary awareness. These trance states were not accidental byproducts of ceremony, but were deliberately induced through techniques that had been refined over generations of spiritual practice. The social bonding that occurred during winter ceremonies created networks of mutual support that extended far beyond the duration of the rituals themselves. Participants developed relationships that would provide emotional and practical assistance throughout the remaining winter months and into the following year's cycle of activities. The midwinter ceremony included the telling of the creation story, the ancient account of how the world began, how the animals and plants came to be, how human beings learned to live in harmony with the natural forces around them. But this was not simply storytelling for entertainment. The recitation of the creation story was understood as a renewal of the world itself, a spoken participation in the ongoing act of creation that kept reality stable and functioning. The creation story, as told during winter ceremonies, differed significantly from versions recounted at other times of year. The winter telling emphasized themes of endurance, transformation, and the cyclical nature of existence. Specific episodes that might be summarized briefly during summer recitations were expanded during winter ceremonies to explore their relevance to seasonal survival and spiritual endurance. The storytelling techniques used in ceremonial contexts involved complex interactions between primary narrators and audience participation. Community members contributed specific elements at predetermined points, creating a collective narrative performance that reinforced social bonds while transmitting cultural knowledge. The rhythm and pacing of ceremonial storytelling was carefully controlled to maintain appropriate spiritual atmosphere and to coordinate with other ceremonial elements like drumming and singing. The creation stories served as both historical account and instruction manual, providing guidance for proper relationships between humans and the natural world. During winter ceremonies, particular attention was paid to episodes that demonstrated how spiritual beings had overcome challenges similar to those facing the winter community: cold, hunger, isolation, and despair. Picture the effect of these ancient words, spoken in the ceremonial longhouse, with snow piling against the walls and the temperature dropping toward the levels that could kill exposed humans within hours. The story spoke of a world before winter, of the first times when animals and plants and people learned to cooperate for mutual survival. It reminded listeners that the current hardships were temporary, part of a larger cycle that had been repeating since the world's beginning. The contrast between the harsh external conditions and the warm, light-filled interior of the ceremonial longhouse created a powerful metaphor for spiritual protection and community resilience. The physical shelter became a symbol of the spiritual shelter provided by traditional knowledge and ceremonial practice. The recitation of stories about cooperation between different forms of life provided models for the human cooperation that was essential for winter survival. The emphasis on cyclical patterns helped participants maintain psychological perspective during the most discouraging parts of winter, when spring seemed impossibly distant and food supplies dangerously low. The specific timing of storytelling within the overall ceremonial sequence was crucial to its effectiveness. Stories were told when participants had reached appropriate states of receptivity through preliminary rituals, and the narrative content was coordinated with other ceremonial elements to create maximum psychological and spiritual impact. But the ceremony also included more mysterious elements, rituals whose exact nature remains hidden even from modern anthropologists working with tribal elders who maintain traditional knowledge. There were sacred objects that were revealed only during the winter ceremony: masks representing spiritual beings associated with winter, rattles made from materials gathered during specific seasons, ceremonial clothing decorated with symbols whose meanings were known only to initiated participants. The secrecy surrounding these sacred objects served multiple functions within traditional spiritual systems. The restriction of knowledge to initiated participants created incentives for young people to seek ceremonial training and accept the responsibilities that came with spiritual knowledge. The protective secrecy also prevented the misuse of powerful spiritual tools by individuals who lacked proper preparation or understanding. The masks used in winter ceremonies represented some of the most sophisticated spiritual technology developed by indigenous communities. These were not simple decorative objects, but were understood as actual interfaces between human consciousness and spiritual forces. The process of creating ceremonial masks involved rituals that were believed to imbue the objects with spiritual power, and their use required specialized knowledge of proper protocols for spiritual communication. The materials used in ceremonial objects were selected according to criteria that combined practical and spiritual considerations. Rattles made from turtle shells carried associations with earth-based spiritual forces, while rattles made from gourds might be connected to plant spirits or seasonal renewal. The timing of material gathering, the ceremonies performed during harvesting, and the preparation methods used all contributed to the spiritual potency of the finished objects. Some of these objects occasionally surface in archaeological contexts, but always fragmentary, always incomplete. A carved bone comb decorated with what appear to be winter symbols, bare trees, falling snow, the footprints of animals moving through drifts. A ceramic vessel painted with spirals that might represent wind patterns or the circular nature of seasonal cycles. A copper ornament shaped like a stylized corn plant, perhaps representing the hope for spring planting that sustained communities through the coldest months. Each artifact raises more questions than it answers. The bone comb, was it used in personal grooming, or was combing hair part of a winter purification ritual? The ceramic vessel, did it hold water for drinking or sacred liquids used in ceremonies? The copper ornament, was it worn as personal decoration or passed from hand to hand during ritual exchanges that bound the community together? The fragmentary nature of archaeological evidence creates a kind of spiritual puzzle that can never be completely solved. Each artifact provides a glimpse into complex ceremonial systems, but the context necessary for full understanding has been lost to time. The bone comb with winter symbols might have been part of personal preparation rituals that readied individuals for ceremonial participation, or it might have been used in the grooming of participants who represented specific spiritual beings during ceremonial performances. The spirals painted on ceramic vessels could represent numerous spiritual concepts: the cyclical movement of seasons, the patterns of wind that brought winter weather, the spiral path of spiritual development, or the complex relationships between different levels of reality that ceremony was designed to navigate. Without access to the oral traditions that would have explained these symbols, archaeologists can only speculate about their specific meanings. The copper ornament shaped like a corn plant raises questions about the relationship between ceremonial objects and agricultural symbolism. Corn plants represented not only physical sustenance but spiritual continuity, the promise that life would persist through winter and renew itself in spring. Such ornaments might have been worn by participants who embodied agricultural spirits during ceremony, or they might have been passed among community members as symbols of shared commitment to spring planting and communal survival. The mystery deepens when we consider the variations across different tribal groups. The Ojibwe of the northern Great Lakes region developed winter ceremonies focused around the sacred fire that burned in the center of the Midewiwin Lodge. But their rituals emphasized different themes: the importance of dreams received during the long winter nights, the spiritual journeys undertaken by shamans seeking guidance for the community's survival. The geographical differences between Haudenosaunee and Ojibwe territories influenced the development of distinct ceremonial traditions adapted to different environmental conditions. The dense forests and numerous lakes of Ojibwe territory created different spiritual landscapes that required different approaches to winter survival and ceremonial practice. The Ojibwe emphasis on dreams and visionary experience reflected the particular challenges of survival in regions where winter isolation was more complete and hunting success more dependent on spiritual guidance. The long winter nights and the altered consciousness that came from cold and reduced nutrition created natural conditions for visionary experience that Ojibwe ceremonialists learned to cultivate and direct for community benefit. The Midewiwin Lodge provided a different kind of ceremonial space than the large longhouses used by the Haudenosaunee. The lodge was smaller and more intimate, designed to create intense spiritual focus rather than large communal gatherings. The sacred fire at the center served not only as a source of physical warmth, but as a spiritual focal point that helped participants achieve the trance states necessary for visionary work. Archaeological evidence from Ojibwe winter sites reveals a different pattern of ceremonial activity. Rather than the large communal gatherings suggested by Haudenosaunee sites, Ojibwe winter ceremonies appear to have involved smaller groups, perhaps individual families or hunting bands isolated by severe weather. The artifacts found at these sites are more personal in scale: carved stone pipes that might have been used for individual prayer, small bundles of sacred materials buried near hearth sites, delicate bone needles decorated with intricate geometric patterns that might have been used in the creation of ceremonial clothing. The smaller scale of Ojibwe winter ceremonies reflected both environmental necessities and spiritual preferences. The harsh conditions of the northern forests often made large gatherings impossible, forcing communities to develop ceremonial practices that could be effective even when performed by isolated small groups. This adaptation led to innovations in personal spiritual practice that complemented and supported the larger communal ceremonies that took place when conditions permitted. The carved stone pipes found at Ojibwe sites represent sophisticated spiritual technology designed for individual use. These pipes were not simply smoking instruments but were understood as devices for communication with spiritual forces. The tobacco burned in these pipes carried prayers and offerings to spiritual realms, while the act of smoking created altered states of consciousness that facilitated spiritual communication. The small bundles of sacred materials found buried near hearth sites suggest personal spiritual practices that paralleled but differed from larger ceremonial activities. These bundles often contained items that had personal significance to individual practitioners: stones from spiritually significant locations, plant materials gathered during vision quests, small carved objects that represented personal spirit helpers. But what did these smaller, more intimate winter ceremonies accomplish? Without the powerful group dynamics of large communal gatherings, how did they serve the psychological and spiritual needs of communities struggling against winter's assault? Perhaps the answer lies in dreams. The emphasis on dreaming in Ojibwe winter spirituality represented a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical survival and psychological well-being. During the most isolated and challenging parts of winter, when external resources for comfort and hope were minimal, the ability to access spiritual guidance through dreams provided essential psychological support. The cultivation of meaningful dreams required specific techniques that were transmitted through spiritual training. Dreamers learned to prepare themselves through fasting, meditation, and ceremonial purification. They developed skills in dream recall and interpretation that enabled them to extract practical guidance from visionary experience. The integration of dream guidance with practical survival decisions created a spiritual approach to winter survival that transformed desperate circumstances into opportunities for spiritual development. Hunters learned to seek spiritual guidance for locating game, while community leaders used dream insight to make decisions about resource allocation and winter strategies. Many northern tribes believed that winter was the season when the boundary between the waking and dreaming worlds became most permeable. The long nights, the altered consciousness that comes from reduced nutrition and extreme cold, the hypnotic effects of staring into fires for warmth, all of these created conditions conducive to visionary experiences. The physiological effects of winter conditions on human consciousness were well understood by indigenous spiritual practitioners. The combination of reduced daylight, cold stress, and limited nutrition created natural alterations in brain chemistry that enhanced the likelihood of visionary experience. Rather than viewing these effects as problems to be overcome, traditional spiritual systems learned to work with them as opportunities for expanded awareness. The long nights of winter provided extended periods for dream work that were not available during other seasons. The rhythm of winter life, with its emphasis on indoor activities and reduced physical demands, created natural opportunities for meditation and spiritual practice that busy summer schedules could not accommodate. The social isolation that often accompanied winter survival created psychological conditions that enhanced individual spiritual development. Without the distractions and social pressures of large group activities, individuals could focus more intensively on personal spiritual practice and on developing direct relationships with spiritual forces. Shamans and ordinary community members alike reported receiving crucial guidance through winter dreams. Dreams that revealed where game animals might be found when hunting became desperate. Dreams that provided new songs, new ceremonies, new ways of understanding the spiritual forces that governed seasonal cycles. Dreams that brought messages from deceased relatives, confirming that death was not an ending but a transformation, and that the ancestors continued to care for the living through winter's trials. The practical applications of dream guidance were extensive and specific. Hunters reported dreams that provided detailed information about animal locations, behavior patterns, and optimal hunting strategies. These dreams often included information that proved to be accurate when tested against actual hunting conditions. The spiritual innovations that emerged from winter dream work often had lasting impact on tribal spiritual practices. New songs received in dreams were incorporated into ceremonial cycles, while new healing techniques or ritual procedures became part of traditional knowledge that was transmitted to future generations. The communication with deceased relatives through winter dreams served essential psychological functions during the season when mortality was most prominent in daily awareness. These dream communications provided comfort and guidance while also maintaining social connections that transcended physical death. The archaeological record provides tantalizing hints of these dream practices. Researchers have found what appear to be dream recording devices, strips of bark inscribed with symbolic markings, sometimes found in bundles near sleeping areas in winter habitation sites. The markings don't correspond to any known writing system, but they show patterns that suggest mnemonic devices, ways of recording and preserving the content of significant dreams. The development of systems for recording dream content represents sophisticated approaches to managing visionary experience. These recording techniques enable dreamers to preserve important details that might otherwise be forgotten, while also providing methods for sharing spiritual insights with other community members. The symbolic systems used for dream recording varied between different tribal groups and individual practitioners. Some systems used pictographic elements that directly represented dream images, while others employed abstract symbols that served as memory triggers for complex spiritual concepts or experiences. The placement of dream recording materials near sleeping areas suggests that these systems were integrated into daily spiritual practice rather than reserved for special ceremonial occasions. The ability to quickly record dream content upon waking was essential for preserving the subtle details that often contained the most important spiritual guidance. More mysteriously, some winter sites contain evidence of what archaeologists term vision quest modifications, alterations to normal living spaces that seem designed to encourage altered states of consciousness. These might include small, isolated areas within larger winter shelters, spaces just large enough for a single person, often positioned where smoke from the central fire would create a semi-enclosed, dimly lit environment perfect for meditation or trance states. The construction of specialized spaces for visionary work within winter habitations represents sophisticated understanding of the environmental conditions that support spiritual practice. These modifications required investments of time and materials during the most resource-constrained season, indicating the high priority placed on maintaining spiritual practice even under survival conditions. The positioning of vision quest spaces in relationship to central fires created carefully controlled environments that balanced physical comfort with the sensory conditions necessary for trance work. The semi-enclosed nature of these spaces provided privacy for personal spiritual work while maintaining connections to the larger community space. The size restrictions of vision quest modifications, spaces just large enough for a single person, reflect understanding of the psychological effects of confined spaces on consciousness. The slight physical discomfort and sensory restriction created by these small spaces enhanced the likelihood of achieving altered states of consciousness necessary for spiritual work. But the deepest mystery of Native American winter ceremonies may be their relationship to time itself. Modern people tend to think of winter as something to be endured, waited out, survived until spring returns. But many indigenous winter ceremonies seem to have been based on a radically different understanding. The belief that human ritual activity could actually influence the passage of seasons, that the community's ceremonial behavior was necessary to ensure winter's eventual end. This understanding reflects a worldview in which time is not simply a passive medium through which events occur, but an active dimension of reality that can be influenced through spiritual practice. The ceremonies were designed not simply to help people cope with winter's passage, but to actively participate in the cosmic processes that determine seasonal cycles. The concept of human agency in seasonal change represents a profound difference from modern scientific understanding of natural processes. But from the perspective of traditional spiritual systems, human consciousness and natural phenomena existed in constant interaction, with ceremonial activity serving as a means of maintaining proper relationships between human communities and the spiritual forces that governed natural cycles. This participatory understanding of seasonal change placed enormous responsibility on ceremonial practitioners. If spring's return depended partly on human spiritual activity, then the proper performance of winter ceremonies became a matter of cosmic importance that extended far beyond local community survival. This was not simply symbolic thinking. Archaeological evidence suggests that some winter ceremonies were timed to coincide with astronomical events: the winter solstice, the first appearance of certain constellations, the specific phases of the moon that marked key points in winter's progression. The ceremonies were understood as humanity's participation in cosmic cycles, rituals that helped maintain the universal balance between cold and warmth, death and life, despair and hope. The astronomical precision required for proper ceremonial timing represents sophisticated scientific knowledge that was preserved and transmitted through spiritual traditions. The ability to predict and track celestial events required observation techniques and mathematical understanding that rivaled the achievements of any ancient civilization. The integration of astronomical observation with spiritual practice created ceremonial systems that operated simultaneously on multiple levels of reality. The physical movements of celestial bodies provided timing for earthly rituals, while the earthly rituals were understood as contributing to the cosmic processes that maintained universal order. The balance between opposing forces, cold and warmth, death and life, despair and hope, was understood as an active process that required constant maintenance through human spiritual activity. The ceremonies provided mechanisms for maintaining this balance even when external conditions seemed to threaten complete domination by winter's destructive forces. Consider the implications of this worldview. If the return of spring depended not just on natural astronomical cycles, but also on human ceremonial activity, then winter survival became more than a matter of storing enough food and maintaining adequate shelter. It became a spiritual responsibility, a sacred duty to perform the rituals that would allow life itself to continue. This spiritual responsibility extended beyond individual or even community survival to encompass responsibility for the continuation of all life. The winter ceremonies were understood as essential maintenance work on the cosmic machinery that sustained not only human existence, but the entire web of relationships that connected all living beings. The sacred duty to perform winter rituals created social systems that ensured ceremonial knowledge would be preserved and transmitted even under the most challenging conditions. Communities developed redundant systems for training ceremonial practitioners, and multiple individuals were prepared to assume leadership roles if primary ceremonialists were unable to fulfill their responsibilities. The understanding of winter ceremonies as cosmic maintenance work also influenced the criteria used for evaluating ceremonial success. The effectiveness of rituals was measured not only by their immediate psychological effects on participants, but by their perceived influence on seasonal cycles and the broader patterns of natural phenomena. This understanding helps explain the archaeological evidence of ceremonial activity during the harshest parts of winter, the offerings buried in frozen ground, the precious food resources devoted to ritual feasting, the tremendous effort invested in gathering communities together when travel was dangerous, and every calorie spent meant reduced chances of survival. The willingness to invest scarce resources in ceremonial activity during survival emergencies demonstrates the depth of traditional commitment to spiritual responsibility. These investments were not seen as luxury expenditures that could be eliminated during hard times, but as essential activities that were most crucial precisely when survival was most threatened. The efforts required to gather communities for winter ceremonies often exceeded the physical challenges of the ceremonies themselves. Travel during winter conditions required specialized knowledge, equipment, and group organization that represented significant investments of time and resources. The fact that communities were willing to make these investments demonstrates the paramount importance placed on ceremonial participation. The communal sharing of precious food resources during ceremonial feasting created social bonds that provided practical survival benefits extending far beyond the duration of the ceremonies. These ritual exchanges established networks of mutual obligation that would provide support systems throughout the remaining winter months. From this perspective, winter ceremonies were not luxuries that communities could afford only when basic survival needs were met. They were essential activities, as crucial to survival as food storage or shelter construction. Without proper ceremonies, spring might not return. Without the maintenance of spiritual balance, the natural world itself might slide into permanent chaos. The integration of spiritual and practical survival strategies created holistic approaches to winter survival that addressed both physical and psychological needs simultaneously. The ceremonies provided not only spiritual comfort but practical benefits through community organization, resource sharing, and the maintenance of social cooperation essential for group survival. The understanding of ceremonies as essential rather than optional activities influenced every aspect of winter preparation. Communities planned their resource allocation to ensure that ceremonial requirements could be met, even under the most challenging survival conditions. The concept of natural chaos resulting from inadequate spiritual maintenance reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between human psychological well-being and perception of natural order. Communities that maintained spiritual equilibrium through ceremonial practice were better equipped to respond effectively to external challenges and to maintain social cooperation under stress. But what happens to such beliefs when the world changes too rapidly for traditional ceremonies to maintain their effectiveness? This question brings us to one of the most poignant aspects of winter ceremony mysteries: the ways these rituals adapted, evolved, or disappeared as native communities faced the disruptions of European colonization. The collision between traditional spiritual systems and European colonial pressures created unprecedented challenges for the maintenance of winter ceremonial traditions. The seasonal timing that had been essential for proper spiritual practice was disrupted by imposed schedules and economic demands that ignored indigenous spiritual cycles. The forced relocation of communities destroyed the relationship between ceremonial practices and specific landscape features that had been essential for proper ritual performance. Sacred sites were abandoned or became inaccessible, while new locations lacked the spiritual associations that had given traditional ceremonies their full power and meaning. The suppression of indigenous spiritual practices by colonial authorities and Christian missionaries created dangerous conditions for the open performance of traditional ceremonies. Winter ceremonies, which had provided essential psychological support during the most challenging season, were forced underground or eliminated entirely from community practice. Some ceremonies survived by going underground, practiced in secret by traditionalists who maintained ancient knowledge despite pressure to abandon indigenous ways. Archaeological evidence from the historic period shows ceremonial activities continuing in modified forms, traditional objects buried in new ways, ancient symbols incorporated into European-style buildings, sacred sites maintained and visited despite official prohibition. The preservation of traditional knowledge under conditions of cultural suppression required enormous courage and sacrifice from traditional practitioners. The risks of maintaining forbidden spiritual practices included legal punishment, social ostracism, and economic disadvantage in colonial systems that rewarded cultural assimilation. The modification of ceremonial practices for secret performance often required significant adaptations that changed both the form and effectiveness of traditional rituals. Ceremonies that had relied on large community gatherings were reduced to small group or individual practices, while rituals that had required specific seasonal timing were compressed into shorter time periods or performed under less than optimal conditions. The archaeological evidence of continuing ceremonial activity during the colonial period provides testimony to the persistence of spiritual commitment despite external pressure. The burial of traditional objects in new contexts suggests that practitioners found ways to maintain spiritual connections even when open ceremonial performance was impossible. Other ceremonies underwent radical transformation, blending indigenous winter practices with Christian seasonal observances to create hybrid rituals that preserved essential spiritual functions while adapting to changed circumstances. The archaeological record shows this process in the evolution of burial practices, architectural styles, and artifact types that combine Native American and European elements in ways that suggest deep cultural synthesis rather than simple adoption of foreign customs. The blending of spiritual traditions created complex ceremonial systems that operated simultaneously within indigenous and Christian frameworks. Winter ceremonies might incorporate Christian prayers and symbols while maintaining traditional timing based on astronomical observations and indigenous spiritual concepts. These hybrid practices allowed communities to preserve essential spiritual functions while avoiding direct conflict with colonial authorities. The architectural evidence of cultural blending includes buildings that combined European construction techniques with traditional spatial arrangements designed for ceremonial use. Churches built in native communities often incorporated design elements that facilitated traditional spiritual practices, while indigenous ceremonial structures might include European materials or decorative motifs that provided protective camouflage for continuing traditional activities. The artifact evidence of ceremonial synthesis includes objects that combine indigenous spiritual symbols with Christian iconography in ways that create new meanings while preserving connections to traditional spiritual concepts. These hybrid objects demonstrate sophisticated strategies for cultural survival that maintain spiritual continuity while adapting to changed political and social circumstances. But many winter ceremonies simply vanished, their knowledge dying with the last initiated practitioners, their sacred objects dispersed or destroyed, their spiritual understanding lost to historical disruption. These losses represent one of archaeology's most frustrating limitations, the inability to recover intangible aspects of human culture, the songs and stories and secret knowledge that existed only in memory and died when memory failed. The loss of ceremonial knowledge represents one of the most profound tragedies of cultural disruption. Unlike material technologies that can be reconstructed from physical evidence, spiritual practices depend on continuous transmission through living traditions. When the chain of transmission is broken, the knowledge becomes irretrievable, regardless of how much archaeological evidence might remain. The destruction of sacred objects during periods of cultural suppression eliminated not only the physical tools of spiritual practice, but also the spiritual power that was believed to reside within these objects. Many traditional belief systems held that sacred objects contained actual spiritual beings or forces that were released or destroyed when the objects were damaged or dispersed. The dispersal of ceremonial materials to museums and private collections created additional barriers to cultural recovery. Even when communities sought to revive traditional practices, they often lacked access to the sacred objects that were considered essential for proper ceremonial performance. The death of elder practitioners without adequate transmission to younger generations created irreversible breaks in traditional knowledge. The complex systems of spiritual understanding that had been developed over centuries could be lost entirely with the death of a single individual who had been the sole repository of particular ceremonial secrets. Yet even in loss, mystery persists. Archaeological sites throughout Native America continue to yield artifacts whose ceremonial significance remains unclear, objects that suggest ritual activities we can no longer decode. A carved wooden mask found in a bog preserved by cold water and peat, its features serene but alien, clearly sacred but impossible to interpret. A cache of crystal fragments buried beneath a winter hearth, arranged in patterns that seem meaningful but defy translation. A set of bone gaming pieces found in a ceremonial context, their rules and significance lost, but their importance obvious from the care with which they were crafted and deposited. The continuing discovery of mysterious ceremonial artifacts creates an ongoing dialogue between past and present that transcends the limitations of archaeological interpretation. These objects speak across centuries in a language that we cannot fully translate but cannot ignore. They remind us that human spiritual creativity has always exceeded our ability to comprehend or categorize it. The bog-preserved mask represents one of the most haunting examples of lost spiritual knowledge. The preservation conditions that maintained its physical form for centuries have provided detailed information about construction techniques and decorative elements, yet the spiritual concepts it embodied remain completely inaccessible. The serenity of its expression suggests spiritual states or beings that we can observe but cannot understand. The crystal fragments arranged beneath winter hearths pose questions about the relationship between indigenous spiritual practices and the use of mineral materials for ceremonial purposes. The careful arrangement suggests knowledge of crystal properties and spiritual applications that may have paralleled similar traditions in other parts of the world, yet the specific meanings and uses remain hidden. The bone gaming pieces found in ceremonial contexts raise questions about the relationship between entertainment and spiritual practice in traditional cultures. The fine craftsmanship and ceremonial burial suggest that these objects had significance far beyond simple recreational use, yet the games they were designed for and their spiritual meanings have vanished with the communities that created them. These artifacts speak to us across centuries, carrying messages we cannot fully decode but cannot ignore. They remind us that human survival has always involved more than simply meeting physical needs. Even in winter's harshest grip, even when starvation was a constant threat and death seemed to lurk in every bitter wind, people found ways to create meaning, to establish connections with the spiritual forces they believed governed their world. The persistence of spiritual creativity under the most challenging physical conditions demonstrates something essential about human nature that transcends specific cultural traditions. The archaeological evidence shows that no matter how desperate the circumstances, communities continued to invest precious resources in activities that served no immediate physical survival function but addressed deeper psychological and spiritual needs. The establishment of connections with spiritual forces during winter's extremity suggests sophisticated understanding of the relationship between physical survival and psychological resilience. Traditional communities recognized that maintaining spiritual equilibrium was not a luxury that could be abandoned during hard times, but an essential component of survival that became more crucial as physical conditions worsened. The creation of meaning from hardship through ceremonial practice represents one of humanity's most remarkable adaptive capabilities. Rather than simply enduring suffering, traditional communities developed spiritual technologies that transformed winter's challenges into opportunities for spiritual growth and community strengthening. As we drift deeper into the mystery of these winter ceremonies, letting their fragmentary evidence wash over us like gentle snowfall, we might reflect on what they suggest about human nature itself. The archaeological record shows that no matter how desperate the circumstances, no matter how reduced the material conditions, people continued to devote precious resources to spiritual activities, to the maintenance of relationships with forces beyond the immediate physical world. This consistent pattern of spiritual investment under physical duress suggests that the human need for meaning and transcendence is not a luxury that emerges only when basic survival needs are met, but a fundamental requirement that persists even under the most challenging conditions. The winter ceremonies represent humanity's refusal to accept that existence could be reduced to mere physical survival. The maintenance of relationships with forces beyond the immediate physical world during winter's extremity demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the interconnected nature of reality. Traditional communities recognized that human well-being depended not only on physical resources but on maintaining proper relationships with the spiritual dimensions of existence. The archaeological evidence of continued ceremonial investment during survival emergencies challenges modern assumptions about rational resource allocation. From traditional perspectives, the resources devoted to spiritual activities were not wasted, but represented essential investments in the non-material factors that ultimately determine survival success. Perhaps this tells us something essential about what it means to be human. Perhaps survival, in its deepest sense, requires not just the preservation of physical life, but the maintenance of meaning, purpose, connection to something larger than individual existence. The winter ceremonies, in all their mysterious complexity, might represent humanity's stubborn refusal to accept mere existence as sufficient, the insistence that life must have significance even when it seems most fragile. The human insistence on significance, even during life's most precarious moments, may represent one of our species' most defining characteristics. The winter ceremonies demonstrate that the search for meaning is not a philosophical luxury, but a survival necessity that enables communities to maintain psychological resilience under extreme stress. The connection to something larger than individual existence appears to be essential for human psychological health, particularly during periods of isolation and hardship. The winter ceremonies provided mechanisms for maintaining these connections, even when physical isolation threatened to sever individuals from larger patterns of meaning and purpose. The stubborn refusal to accept mere existence as sufficient drives the human creativity that has enabled our species to adapt to environments and challenges that would overwhelm purely biological survival strategies. The spiritual technologies developed for winter survival represent innovations as crucial to human success as any material technology. The sacred fires that burned in ceremonial longhouses have long since turned to ash. The songs that called for spring's return have faded into silence. The intricate dances that help turn the wheel of seasons exist now only in archaeological speculation and fragmentary tribal memory. But the mystery they represented, the human capacity to find spiritual resources even in the midst of physical extremity, continues to shimmer like heat waves above winter fires, visible but impossible to grasp directly. The physical traces of ancient ceremonies, the ash from sacred fires, the worn earth from dancing grounds, the buried offerings to spiritual forces, provide tangible connections to spiritual realities that transcended their material expressions. These archaeological remains carry echoes of human encounters with the sacred that continue to resonate across centuries. The fading of ancient songs into silence represents one of the most profound losses in human cultural history. These songs carried not only aesthetic beauty but functional spiritual knowledge that enabled communities to maintain psychological and social equilibrium during their most challenging experiences. The disappearance of traditional dances eliminates embodied knowledge that connected human movement to cosmic rhythms and seasonal cycles. These dances were not entertainment but spiritual technology that enabled participants to align their consciousness with larger patterns of natural and spiritual order. Yet, the essential mystery, the human capacity to find spiritual resources under extreme conditions, persists in forms that transcend specific cultural expressions. This capacity continues to manifest whenever human beings face challenges that exceed their material resources and must draw upon inner reserves of meaning, purpose, and transcendent connection. As sleep begins to settle around us like soft snow, we might listen for echoes of those ancient ceremonies in the winter wind. Not literal sounds, but something deeper. The persistent human faith that hardship is temporary, that meaning can be found even in suffering, that community and ritual and the careful tending of sacred fires can carry us through any darkness toward the promise of renewal. The winter wind carries more than weather. It carries the accumulated spiritual wisdom of countless generations who faced winter's challenges with courage, creativity, and faith. The listening for these echoes requires a kind of spiritual archaeology that goes beyond physical evidence to recover the essential insights that enabled human communities to transform survival into significance. The faith in hardship's temporary nature represents one of humanity's most essential survival tools. This faith was maintained not through denial of winter's reality, but through spiritual practices that connected immediate suffering to larger cycles of renewal and regeneration. The discovery of meaning within suffering transforms the experience of hardship from meaningless endurance to spiritual opportunity. The winter ceremonies provided frameworks for understanding challenge as teacher, isolation as opportunity for inner development, and community cooperation as sacred practice. The metaphor of sacred fires represents the human capacity to maintain spiritual warmth even when external conditions threaten to extinguish all sources of comfort and hope. These inner fires require constant tending through practices that connect individual consciousness to sources of meaning that transcend immediate circumstances. The mysteries remain unsolved, the ceremonies largely lost, the full meaning of winter's sacred practices buried beneath centuries of cultural change. But the questions they raise continue to drift through consciousness like snowflakes, each one carrying a fragment of wisdom about survival, spirituality, and the human capacity to find light in the deepest darkness. The persistence of unsolved mysteries maintains a kind of spiritual archaeology that continues to engage contemporary consciousness with questions that transcend specific cultural contexts. These questions address fundamental aspects of human nature that remain relevant regardless of technological or social changes. The burial of sacred practices beneath layers of cultural change creates archaeological challenges that mirror the spiritual challenges faced by individuals seeking to recover connection to essential sources of meaning and purpose. The excavation of spiritual wisdom requires tools that combine intellectual understanding with direct spiritual experience. The fragments of wisdom that drift through consciousness like snowflakes suggest that traditional spiritual knowledge continues to be accessible through modes of awareness that transcend linear learning. This wisdom emerges spontaneously whenever individuals open themselves to the deeper patterns of existence that underlie surface cultural forms. And in the morning, when we wake to whatever winter we face in our own lives, we might remember that we are connected to countless generations who gathered around fires, who told stories, who performed rituals designed to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible. Their specific ceremonies may be lost to us, but their fundamental insight remains. Survival is always both a physical and spiritual challenge, and meeting it requires not just practical knowledge, but faith in the possibility of renewal. The connection to ancestral wisdom provides resources for contemporary challenges that transcend the specific forms through which that wisdom was originally expressed. The essential insights about survival, community, and spiritual resilience remain accessible even when their traditional expressions have been lost or transformed. The recognition that survival encompasses both physical and spiritual dimensions challenges contemporary approaches to problem-solving that focus exclusively on material solutions. The winter ceremonies demonstrate that human well-being depends as much on meaning, purpose, and transcendent connection as on adequate resources and physical security. The faith in renewal possibilities provides psychological resources that enable individuals and communities to persist through challenges that would otherwise overwhelm their capacity for resistance. This faith is not naive optimism, but mature spiritual understanding based on direct experience of life's cyclical nature. The winter ceremonies are calling to us still, their mystery intact, their essential message as relevant now as it was in the coldest longhouse nights of centuries past. Listen carefully, and perhaps you can hear them in the winter wind, the whispered promise that spring will come, that communities endure, that the sacred fires of human meaning never truly go out, no matter how bitter the cold or how long the night. The continuing call of ancient ceremonies suggests that spiritual wisdom transcends the historical circumstances of its origin and remains available to contemporary consciousness through modes of awareness that bypass cultural transmission. This wisdom emerges whenever individuals align themselves with the deeper rhythms of existence that underlie surface changes. The intact mystery maintains a kind of spiritual portal that connects contemporary experience with the essential insights developed by traditional communities for meeting life's fundamental challenges. This mystery preserves access to resources that cannot be fully captured by rational analysis, but remain available through direct spiritual engagement. The relevance of ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges demonstrates the continuity of human nature, despite technological and social changes. The basic spiritual and psychological needs addressed by winter ceremonies remain constant across cultures and historical periods. The promise of renewal, community endurance, and persistent meaning provides hope that transcends specific circumstances and addresses the fundamental human need for confidence in life's essential goodness. This hope, maintained through centuries of winter ceremonies, continues to offer resources for contemporary individuals facing their own seasons of challenge and change. As the mysteries of winter ceremonies fade into the gentle darkness around us, let us turn our attention to a more earthly reality, the subtle but crucial differences that social position made during winter's harshest trials. For while we have walked through the struggles of ordinary families and marveled at the spiritual resources that sustained entire communities, we must also acknowledge a quieter truth. Not everyone faced winter's challenges from the same starting point. Picture yourself now standing outside that familiar longhouse where we began our journey, but this time let your gaze drift to another dwelling a short distance away. Larger, positioned more favorably in relation to prevailing winds, surrounded by the subtle markers that indicate this is the home of someone whose survival is considered essential to the entire community's welfare. This is where the chief lives, and the differences, though never dramatic, tell a story about how leadership functions when every calorie counts, and every degree of warmth might mean the difference between life and death. The distinctions we're about to explore are not the stark inequalities of European feudalism or the vast disparities of modern wealth. Native American societies, shaped by the absolute democracy of winter survival, could not afford extreme inequality, but they did develop sophisticated systems that ensured their most crucial members, chiefs, shamans, skilled craftspeople, and keepers of essential knowledge, received the slight advantages that might mean the difference between a community losing its leadership to winter's attrition or emerging from the cold months with its social fabric intact. Let us drift closer to this chief's longhouse, moving as quietly as falling snow, observing the subtle signs that mark privilege in a world where privilege must always be justified by contribution to collective survival. The longhouse itself is perhaps 20% larger than the one we inhabited with the common family. Not ostentatiously bigger, that would violate the egalitarian principles that governed most Native American societies, but large enough to accommodate the extra responsibilities that come with leadership. This is where community meetings are held during winter storms that make travel between dwellings dangerous. This is where visiting dignitaries from other bands are housed when diplomatic business requires winter travel. This is where the sacred objects are stored that emerge only during the most important ceremonies. The positioning of the dwelling shows similar subtle advantages. It sits in a natural depression that provides some protection from the prevailing winter winds, yet on ground high enough to avoid the pooling of cold air that settles in the lowest areas on the coldest nights. The entrance faces southeast, positioned to catch the maximum benefit from winter sun during the brief hours when solar warmth might penetrate the longhouse interior. These seem like small considerations, but in a world where a few degrees of temperature difference could determine whether an elderly person survives the night, such positioning represents careful planning and acknowledged privilege. Inside, the differences become more apparent, though still bounded by the practical limitations that winter imposed on everyone. The chief's family sleeps closer to the central fire than the other families sharing the longhouse. Not dramatically closer, the longhouse remains a communal space where cooperation is essential, but close enough that the patriarch and matriarch receive the maximum benefit from the carefully maintained flames. Their sleeping furs are of slightly higher quality, the result of tribute relationships with skilled hunters and the chief's own access to the best parts of animals killed during community hunts. A magnificent bearskin serves as the foundation of their sleeping area, its thick fur providing insulation that common families might achieve only by layering multiple smaller pelts. Wolf fur lines their winter clothing, offering warmth to weight advantages that make winter travel more feasible when leadership duties require movement between communities. But perhaps the most significant privilege lies in food security. Not abundance, winter never allowed true abundance for anyone, but the subtle buffer that comes from tribute obligations and reciprocal relationships that acknowledge the chief's role in community survival. Each family in the band contributes a small portion of their stored food to what might be called a leadership reserve. A few handfuls of corn from each family's winter stores, some dried meat from each successful hunt, nuts and berries from each family's gathering efforts. Individually, these contributions represent minor sacrifices. Collectively, they provide the chief's family with perhaps 20% more calories than they would have through their own labor alone. This extra food serves multiple functions beyond simple nutrition. It provides the energy necessary for the chief to travel between communities during winter emergencies, to host diplomatic visitors who arrive unexpectedly, to remain alert during the long, nighttime deliberations that winter crises often required. A chief weakened by hunger could not serve the community effectively, so ensuring adequate nutrition for leadership was understood as collective insurance against the disasters that could befall leaderless groups. But the privilege came with profound responsibilities that ordinary families never faced. Consider the psychological burden of being responsible for decisions that might determine whether entire families lived or died. When food stores ran low, the chief decided which families received emergency distributions from the community reserves. When winter hunting parties needed to be organized, the chief balanced the need for fresh meat against the risk of losing hunters to blizzards or accidents. When conflicts arose between families stressed by winter's privations, the chief mediated disputes that could fracture the community cooperation essential for survival. Picture the chief lying awake during the coldest nights, listening to the wind outside and calculating resources with a precision that would determine not just his own family's survival, but the fate of perhaps 50 or 60 people under his leadership. The extra food and warmth provided some physical comfort, but they came at the cost of constant mental strain that ordinary community members never experienced. The chief's wife faced parallel pressures. As the senior woman in the community, she was expected to coordinate the collective activities that kept families functioning during winter's isolation. She organized the sharing of resources when some families' stores ran dangerously low. She mediated the social tensions that arose when people were confined together for months in close quarters. She maintained the diplomatic relationships with women from other bands that might prove crucial if her community needed refuge or assistance during particularly harsh winters. Her privileges reflected these responsibilities. She wore clothing decorated with quill work and beadwork that marked her status, but the fine craftsmanship also served practical diplomatic functions. When representatives from other communities arrived, her appearance communicated her band's stability and prosperity. The time invested in creating such clothing represented community resources devoted to maintaining the relationships that might be essential for long-term survival. She also had preferential access to medicinal plants and healing knowledge, not because she was considered more deserving of health than common community members, but because her knowledge and physical condition were considered community resources. She often served as the primary healer for her band, maintaining expertise in plant medicines, surgical techniques, and the complex preparations that could mean the difference between recovery and death from winter injuries or illnesses. During the most desperate periods of winter scarcity, she might be the one who decided how to distribute the last reserves of healing plants. Which sick children received the limited supply of fever-reducing willow bark? Which injured adults got the precious stores of wound-healing herbs? These decisions required not just medical knowledge, but the moral authority that came with her position and the understanding that her choices would be remembered and judged by the community for years to come. But perhaps the most complex winter privileges belong to the shamans, the spiritual specialists whose role became most crucial during the season when the boundary between life and death seemed thinnest. These individuals occupied a unique position in winter survival hierarchies, simultaneously essential and vulnerable, revered and feared, privileged and isolated. The shaman's longhouse was often positioned at the edge of the community, far enough from the main residential area to provide privacy for spiritual activities, but close enough for quick access during emergencies. This physical separation reflected the complex relationship between shamans and the communities they served. Their spiritual power was considered essential for winter survival, but that same power made some community members uncomfortable during the long, confined months when tensions ran high and suspicions flourished. Inside the shaman's dwelling, the differences from common homes were immediately apparent. Sacred objects occupied prominent positions, carved masks representing winter spirits, bundles of medicinal plants gathered during specific seasons, drums and rattles used in healing ceremonies, crystals and stones believed to hold spiritual power. These items required careful storage and protection, taking up space that ordinary families would have devoted to practical necessities. The shaman's food privileges were perhaps the most complex in the community. During successful times, families contributed generously to the shaman's stores, acknowledging the spiritual services that helped ensure good hunting, favorable weather, and protection from the malevolent forces that winter was believed to unleash. But during times of scarcity, the shaman's position became more precarious. If his healing ceremonies failed to save sick community members, if his weather predictions proved inaccurate, if his spiritual interventions seemed ineffective against winter's assault, the community's generosity could quickly turn to resentment. Shamans who received extra food during autumn abundance might find themselves blamed for winter disasters and excluded from emergency distributions when resources became critically scarce. This created a unique form of winter anxiety for shamans, not just the ordinary concerns about food and warmth that affected everyone, but the additional pressure of maintaining their spiritual effectiveness under conditions that made such effectiveness difficult to demonstrate. How do you prove that your ceremonies are preventing disasters that might have occurred without spiritual intervention? How do you maintain community confidence in your abilities when winter's random cruelties seem to strike regardless of ritual precautions? Successful shamans developed sophisticated strategies for managing these pressures. They cultivated extensive knowledge of practical healing techniques alongside their spiritual practices, ensuring that their interventions produced tangible results even when their spiritual explanations remained mysterious to ordinary community members. They maintained careful diplomatic relationships with other spiritual specialists in neighboring communities, creating networks that could provide refuge if local opinion turned against them. Most importantly, they understood that winter privilege had to be constantly earned and re-earned. The extra food, the special clothing, the deference shown to their spiritual authority, all of these could disappear overnight if the community decided that the shaman's contributions were not worth the resources they consumed. This precarious nature of winter privilege extended to other specialized roles within Native American communities. The skilled craftspeople who made the tools essential for winter survival, the specialists in hafting stone blades, weaving baskets, preparing hides, creating the complex implements needed for hunting, food processing, and shelter construction, received recognition and resources that reflected their importance to collective survival. But their privileges were always conditional, always dependent on continued performance of their specialized skills. A toolmaker whose arrowheads broke at crucial moments during winter hunts would quickly find his status and resource access diminished. A basket weaver whose storage containers failed to protect stored food from moisture or pests would face community displeasure that translated directly into reduced winter support. The most secure privileges belonged to the elderly specialists who served as repositories of crucial survival knowledge. These were the individuals who remembered the locations of emergency food sources, who could predict weather patterns from subtle environmental signs, who maintained the oral histories that preserved essential information about surviving extreme winters in the past. Such individuals received consistent care and protection even when their physical contributions to community work declined with age. Their knowledge was understood as a form of wealth more precious than food stores or warm clothing, information that could save entire communities during unprecedented crises. Families competed to host these elderly experts, understanding that access to their knowledge represented both honor and practical advantage. But even these respected elders faced the ultimate democracy of winter survival. When resources became critically scarce, when choices had to be made about distributing the last emergency food reserves, age and wisdom did not automatically guarantee survival. The most revered elder still had to eat, still required warmth, still faced the same biological limitations that winter imposed on all human beings. The archaeological record provides fascinating glimpses into these winter privilege systems. Excavations of winter habitation sites often reveal clear differences in the quality and quantity of artifacts associated with different dwelling areas. Higher status areas contain more elaborate pottery, finer stone tools, greater concentrations of rare materials that indicate access to long-distance trade networks. But these differences are always matters of degree rather than kind. The chief might have access to slightly better tools, but they were made from the same materials and using the same techniques available to ordinary community members. The shaman might possess more elaborate ceremonial objects, but they were created within the same artistic traditions that produced the humbler items used by common families. This pattern reflects the fundamental reality that winter survival imposed strict limits on how much inequality any Native American society could sustain. No one could afford to support non-productive elites during seasons when every individual's contribution might determine collective survival. Leadership privilege had to be constantly justified by leadership performance, and even the most successful leaders remained vulnerable to the random disasters that winter could inflict on anyone. As we let this exploration of winter hierarchies settle around us like gently falling snow, we might reflect on how different these systems were from the privileged structures of agricultural and industrial societies. Native American winter privileges were always temporary, always conditional, always bounded by the practical requirements of collective survival in harsh environments. The chief's extra warmth came with the burden of life and death decision-making. The shaman's spiritual authority carried the constant risk of blame for disasters beyond anyone's control. The craftsperson's elevated status depended on continued demonstration of essential skills. Even the most privileged individuals remained subject to winter's ultimate authority, the cold democracy that reduced all human pretensions to the basic requirements of calories, warmth, and shelter. Perhaps this offers a different perspective on leadership itself. In societies where privilege had to be constantly earned and re-earned, where authority came with genuine responsibility for others' survival, where the highest status individuals remained vulnerable to the same natural forces that threatened everyone, leadership became a form of service rather than domination. The warmth of the chief's fire was shared with visitors and refugees. The shaman's spiritual power was deployed for community benefit. The craftsperson's skills were used to create tools that enhanced everyone's survival chances. Even during winter's harshest trials, when resources were most scarce and tensions highest, privilege served collective rather than purely individual purposes. As sleep begins to claim us and the comfortable warmth of our modern homes contrasts with the careful calculations that determined who stayed warm in winter longhouses centuries ago, we might appreciate the delicate balance these societies achieved between acknowledging individual contributions and maintaining collective solidarity. Their privileged systems remind us that leadership need not mean exploitation, that authority can serve community welfare, that even in the harshest circumstances, societies can develop ways of recognizing essential contributions without abandoning the fundamental equality that survival situations demand. The fires in the chief's longhouse have long since turned to ash. The shaman's drums are silent. The skilled craftspeople have been dust for centuries. But the principles they embodied, that privilege must be earned, that authority requires service, that even the highest status remains subject to natural limitations, continue to drift through human consciousness like snowflakes, each one carrying a fragment of wisdom about leadership, responsibility, and the delicate balance between individual recognition and collective survival. And perhaps in the morning, when we wake to whatever responsibilities and privileges shape our own lives, we might remember that every advantage carries obligations, that authority is meaningful only when it serves others' welfare, and that the warmest fires are always those that provide light for entire communities rather than heat for a fortunate few. The winter wind continues to blow outside our imaginary longhouses, but it carries with it the whispered wisdom of societies that learn to balance individual recognition with collective survival, creating systems of privilege bounded by service and sustained by the understanding that all human authority remains subject to forces larger than any individual ambition. Listen carefully, and perhaps you can hear them still, the voices of leaders who understood that their warmth came with responsibilities, their privileges with obligations, their status with the constant requirement to prove worthy of the trust that winter survival demanded. As our journey through the winter world of Native America draws to its gentle close, let us settle back into the warm darkness that surrounds us now, feeling the contrast between the harsh realities we have witnessed and the comfortable security that cradles us in this modern moment. The longhouse fires we have sat beside exist now only in memory and imagination, but their warmth continues to reach across centuries, carrying lessons that time has not diminished. We began tonight in the pre-dawn cold of an ordinary longhouse, sharing the daily struggle of people whose names have been lost to history, but whose quiet endurance shaped the very foundations of human survival knowledge. We felt the bite of winter air against skin, the gnawing persistence of carefully rationed hunger, the weight of decisions where every choice might mean the difference between life and death for entire families. That morning routine, The cautious awakening, the careful addition of precious fuel to dying fires, the mental arithmetic of calories and warmth that governed every moment, seems impossibly distant from our own morning rituals. When we wake tomorrow, heat will flow at the touch of a thermostat. Light will flood our rooms at the flip of a switch. Food will be available in quantities that would have seemed miraculous to those longhouse dwellers, requiring no more effort than a journey to a refrigerator that maintains perfect preservation without any conscious attention from us. Yet in that vast distance between their world and ours, something essential remains unchanged. The fundamental human capacity for endurance, for adaptation, for finding ways to create meaning and maintain hope, even when circumstances seem to offer nothing but hardship. The people we walked beside tonight possessed something that no amount of modern comfort can replace: an intimate knowledge of their own resilience, a deep faith in their ability to survive whatever challenges winter might bring. From their ordinary struggles, we drifted into the extraordinary story of Tisquantum, the man who learned that survival sometimes requires becoming someone entirely new. His journey from Patuxet village to Spanish slavery, to English captivity and back to a transformed homeland showed us that the skills developed during harsh New England winters, patience, careful observation, the ability to adapt to constantly changing circumstances, could serve not just seasonal survival, but survival of cultural catastrophes that seemed to destroy everything familiar. Tisquantum's story reminds us that the deepest winter knowledge is not about avoiding hardship, but about discovering resources within ourselves that emerge only when everything external fails. His childhood training in winter patience became the foundation for navigating between worlds, for serving as a bridge between peoples who had no other way to understand each other. The corn and fish planting technique he taught the Plymouth colonists was more than agricultural knowledge. It was a metaphor for the kind of adaptive thinking that allows communities to take root in alien environments. In his final years, moving constantly between English settlements and native communities, serving as translator not just of languages but of entire worldviews, Tisquantum embodied a truth about human survival that winter teaches with particular clarity. Sometimes the old ways must be transformed rather than simply preserved. Sometimes survival requires becoming someone who could not have existed in the original world, someone shaped by loss, but not defeated by it. From individual resilience, we move deeper into the mysterious realm of winter ceremonies, those sacred fires that burned not just for warmth, but to maintain the spiritual balance that indigenous peoples believed kept the world itself functioning. Here we encountered one of the most profound insights about human survival, that physical endurance alone is never sufficient. People need meaning, purpose, connection to forces larger than immediate necessity. The midwinter ceremonies of the Haudenosaunee, the sacred fires of the Ojibwe, the dream practices that allowed communities to receive guidance during the darkest months, all of these represented humanity's refusal to accept mere existence as adequate. Even when resources were most scarce, when every calorie represented a choice between immediate and future survival, communities devoted precious energy to maintaining spiritual practices they believed essential for cosmic balance. The archaeological traces of these ceremonies, the carefully arranged corn offerings, the ritual objects buried in frozen ground, the sacred spaces constructed within winter shelters, speak to us across centuries with a message about human nature that modern life sometimes obscures. We are not merely biological organisms programmed for survival. We are meaning-making creatures who require spiritual nourishment as urgently as we need physical sustenance. The mystery that surrounds these winter ceremonies, the knowledge that has been lost to time and cultural disruption, carries its own teaching. Some of the most important aspects of human survival cannot be preserved in artifacts or written records. They exist only in the living practice of communities, in the shared understanding that passes from generation to generation through participation rather than explanation. When those communities are disrupted, when the chain of transmission is broken, something irreplaceable disappears from human knowledge. The winter ceremonies remind us that cultural survival is as important as physical survival, that preserving meaning-making traditions requires the same careful attention that indigenous peoples devoted to storing food and maintaining fires. Finally, we explored the delicate hierarchies that shaped winter survival, the subtle privileges that ensured essential leadership and specialized knowledge were preserved for community benefit. Here we discovered perhaps the most sophisticated insight about human organization, that even necessary inequalities can be structured to serve collective rather than individual purposes. The chief's extra warmth came with life and death responsibilities for entire communities. The shaman's spiritual authority carried constant vulnerability to blame for disasters beyond anyone's control. The skilled craftsperson's elevated status depended on continued demonstration of essential abilities. Even the most privileged individuals remained subject to winter's ultimate democracy, the biological requirements that reduced all human pretensions to the basic needs for calories, warmth, and shelter. These privilege systems offer a different model for thinking about leadership and authority. In societies where advantage had to be constantly earned through service, where the highest status individuals faced the greatest responsibilities, where privilege was always bounded by natural limitations that affected everyone, leadership became a form of mutual aid rather than domination. The warmth in the chief's longhouse was shared with refugees and visitors. The shaman's knowledge was deployed for community healing. The craftsperson's skills were used to create tools that enhanced everyone's survival chances. Even during winter's harshest trials, individual advantages served collective welfare. As we let these lessons settle around us like gently falling snow, we might reflect on what they suggest about our own relationship to hardship, adaptation, and community. The people whose winter worlds we have explored tonight lived with uncertainties that would terrify most modern individuals. They faced regular threats to their physical survival that we can barely imagine. They endured privations that would seem unbearable to people accustomed to instant gratification and constant comfort. Yet their lives were not characterized by despair or resignation. Archaeological evidence shows communities that maintain sophisticated artistic traditions, complex social relationships, rich spiritual practices, and deep stores of joy and celebration even during the harshest winters. They found ways to create beauty, meaning, and connection under circumstances that might seem to allow only for bare survival. Perhaps this suggests something important about human adaptability that our comfortable modern lives sometimes obscure. We are capable of finding fulfillment and creating meaningful communities under a far wider range of circumstances than we typically imagine. The resources for survival, adaptation, and even flourishing exist within us, waiting to be discovered when external circumstances require their activation. The winter survival knowledge we have explored tonight is not just historical curiosity. Climate change, economic instability, social disruption, and global pandemics remind us that the comfortable predictability of modern life may be more fragile than we sometimes assume. The skills, attitudes, and wisdom developed by indigenous communities during their harshest seasons may prove relevant to challenges we have not yet learned to anticipate. But perhaps the most important lesson from our winter journey is not about preparing for hypothetical future hardships, but about appreciating the resources we possess right now, the capacity for patience learned during childhood struggles, the ability to find meaning in difficult circumstances, the knowledge that communities can endure hardships that would overwhelm individuals, the deep faith that spring eventually comes, even to the longest winters. These resources exist within each of us, often hidden beneath layers of comfort and convenience that make them seem unnecessary. But they remain available, waiting to be rediscovered when circumstances require their activation. The indigenous peoples whose winter wisdom we have shared tonight understood these resources intimately, not as abstract concepts, but as practical tools essential for survival. Their knowledge was earned through direct experience with the natural forces that shaped human life for millennia, before the development of technologies that insulate us from immediate environmental challenges. They learned patience from winters that could not be hurried. They developed community cooperation through circumstances that made individual survival impossible. They discovered spiritual resources through encounters with forces that humbled all human pretensions. We who live in heated homes, surrounded by stored food we did not gather, protected by systems we did not create, might seem to have little in common with the longhouse dwellers whose struggles opened our journey tonight. But the fundamental human capacities they developed and relied upon remain unchanged. The need for meaning, for community, for connection to forces larger than individual desire, these persist regardless of technological advancement or material comfort. As drowsiness begins to settle over us like a soft blanket, we might carry with us some of the quiet confidence that sustained those winter communities through their darkest months. The knowledge that human beings are remarkably adaptable, that communities can endure hardships that seem impossible to overcome, that the resources for survival and even flourishing exist within us, waiting to be discovered when circumstances require their activation. The longhouse fires we have sat beside tonight have burned down to glowing embers, their heat radiating into darkness that seems less threatening now, more like a gentle embrace than a hostile force. The wind outside carries not just the bite of cold, but the promise of change, of seasons that turn despite all appearances of permanence, of spring that comes even to the longest winters. Tomorrow, when we wake to our comfortable modern mornings, we might remember the people who taught us that survival is always both a physical and spiritual challenge, that communities are stronger than individuals, that meaning can be found even in the harshest circumstances. We might appreciate the vast distance we have traveled from their world to ours, while recognizing that the essential human qualities they embodied remain as relevant now as they were in the coldest longhouse nights of centuries past. The snow continues to fall outside our imaginary dwellings, but it no longer represents only hardship and threat. It carries also the wisdom of those who learned to find beauty in winter landscapes, who discovered that scarcity can teach appreciation, who understood that the most precious warmth comes not from fires alone, but from the communities that gather around them. Let us sleep now with gratitude for the comfortable security that surrounds us, and with respect for those whose struggles and wisdom made our comfort possible. Let us dream of longhouse fires that burn eternally in the human heart, providing warmth that no winter can extinguish, light that no darkness can overcome. The indigenous peoples whose winter world we have shared tonight would understand that the stories we tell ourselves about survival, about community, about the meaning we create in the face of hardship, are as important as any physical preparation for difficult times. They would recognize that the fire of human resilience once kindled can burn through any winter, providing heat and light for countless generations yet to come. And perhaps if we listen carefully to the winter wind that whispers around our modern homes, we can hear their voices still, patient, enduring, full of quiet wisdom about the art of surviving not just winter, but all the seasons of human experience with grace, community, and unshakable hope. Sleep well, fellow travelers. Spring always comes to those who maintain the fires that matter most. As the story fades, thank you for spending this quiet time with me. If you'd like more slow journeys like this, almost every day, you're welcome to subscribe. There's another soft-spoken tale waiting right here, or you can tap below to stay close to our nighttime history community. Rest easy, and I'll see you soon.